Today we have a crazy revenge story that was a long time coming. We'll get into that in a bit, but first, I think my father hates my husband and son, so I stopped him from coming over to our house. I, 30-year-old female, am tired of constantly trying to pick sides between my dad and my family. My early years as a kid was mostly me, my mom, and my younger brother together. I don't think I ever remember my dad being present for the little memorable days like my birthdays or my graduation. My dad was in the military force, and he moved around a lot. There were times my brother and I talked to him on the phone, but my dad was a disciplined man who demanded a certain level of respect, so it was more like we were talking to an officer than a dad. The silver lining was my mom was the opposite of these things. She made sure we felt loved in every way and tried her best to fill in the role of our dad, especially in the case of my younger brother. She always wanted him to tell her every little thing because she felt guilty about him not being able to have a male role model at home. But my younger brother wasn't exactly the opened type of person, so they argued a lot. Fast forward to 10 years ago when my dad retired from service. We were older, I was in college at the time, while younger brother was a senior in high school. And you can guess he and my dad did not get along. My younger brother would call about 5 times a day to rant about something my dad did, and it was a lot, from my dad seizing his video games because he was too unfocused, to plating him large portions of food because he was too skinny and wanted him to look like a man. It was like my little bro was in heck, and as soon as the opportunity came, he left home without looking back. I didn't have to deal with my father's wrath until I brought my fiancé home about 7 years ago. That was when it started. My mom was a sweetheart as usual, but my dad couldn't wait to start bombarding my fiancé with questions. At first, I thought it was nice to have my father protective of me until he started giving my fiancé an attitude on the table. Nothing my fiancé ever did was good enough. I remember my fiancé added a bit more salt to his dish and my dad was like, "Are you trying to insult us by telling us the food is bland?" It was unbearable and embarrassing. I went off on him on the table telling him my fiancé and I would not be insulted by him. My fiancé, Ryan, and I left the dinner table without so much as a goodbye. Ryan, being a sweet man, tried to convince me to go back, but my mind was made up. My dad wouldn't have stopped and I knew it. The next day, my mom and dad came to apologize to Ryan and I for my dad's rude behavior, which must have been forced from my mom's end because I know my dad would never willingly admit he was wrong. My mom tried explaining to me about how my dad had been struggling to adapt to his new life after spending so much time being away, which got me thinking maybe I was being too hard on my dad. Mom had a point. He spent most of his years away from us and made his way back to us. Many people would kill for that, so I decided to let things go. My dad became more quiet during dinners when Ryan and I came around. It was like he was trying to hold back from saying anything. And honestly, it annoyed me because he shouldn't have anything wrong to say about Ryan in the first place. But at least he was trying. I spoke to my mom about therapy for my dad. It could be a good way for him to heal from whatever he went through, but the man was stubborn. He believed therapy was for the weak, and the mind is strong enough to resist any trauma. I got married 6 years ago, and not too long after, I found out I was pregnant. I was so excited to share the news with my family and my husband. My dad was so happy about the news, it came as a shock to me. When it was time to reveal the gender and I told him it was a boy, my dad was the happiest. Even more than my husband and I, who were about to be new parents. It was as like my dad became a totally different person. He came around more often to our house and showered me with lots of gifts. I once told my mom about his change in behavior, and she told me not to think too much of it. It was a chance for my dad to be the father he never got to be to us. I tried to be more inviting and understanding to my dad as he came by more often. My husband never said anything or complained about it, even when my father was rude to him. I never understood why he disliked my husband so much until I decided to summon the courage to ask my dad what exactly his beef was with my husband. His response was, "He isn't man enough to take care of you and your unborn child. He looks too skinny and doesn't make enough to take care of all of your needs." This was funny to me because if anyone should be in any position to utter such a statement, it shouldn't be my dad who spent almost 20 years of his life away from us. And sure, my husband may be a little skinny, but he did his best to provide for us, and he stuck around. I immediately got defensive and told my dad if he wanted to keep coming to my house, he must play nice with my husband. Things got better between my husband and my dad. They weren't the best of friends, but my dad made an effort and I saw this. Not too long afterwards, I gave birth to my son, and it was a moment of celebration. My younger brother, who I hadn't seen in years, which I'm sure was to avoid my dad, came around. And my dad was less hostile and unkind, even when my husband's parents came around. There was no snarky comment or any form of insult or body shaming, and that made me even happier because my younger brother stayed a while at home, so we were able to catch up on a lot. Things were fine with everyone. My dad constantly came to visit his grandson, which was fine by me. After all, my parents didn't live too far away, so it was convenient. I try to balance things out by taking my son to my in-laws during the holidays, since they live far away from us, and taking him to my parents' house every weekend. It was nice to have some alone time after a stressful working week, so I saw it as a win. About a year ago, I found out I was pregnant with my second child. While it was exciting news, I had recently just gotten a job in a new law firm. And it was one of those top firms I managed to secure after a lot of work, so it wasn't exactly the right time. I wasn't expecting the pregnancy to take a toll on me. The excruciating morning sickness and nausea made me weak, so when my mom asked to help with my son, I gladly accepted. Between working late at my new job and trying to appear professional while being pregnant, I was struggling to keep a balance between my work life and my personal life. My husband was always traveling due to the nature of his job, so he and I eventually decided it would be best if my parents took care of my son for a little while till I adjusted properly to my new job. Since it was my parents, I felt secured and left my son with them. It was simple since I knew the first 3 days of the week are the most busy days. I left my son with my parents, and he stays with me from Thursday to Sunday afternoon, and by Sunday evening, he's back at his grandparents' house. I didn't notice anything strange at first. My boy seemed okay, and he was always so excited to go to his grandparents' house. I noticed a little scratch on his knee once and asked him about it. He said he fell, and I believed him. Then I noticed a scar by his elbow, and he said it was playing with his friends and he fell, and of course I believed him because why would a 5-year-old lie? But then there were days when my son would complain about feeling pains in his joints and all over his body. I never thought much of it and would always give him a light massage before he goes to bed. Most nights, it was like my son wanted to say something but refrain himself from talking. I should have pushed him to talk, but I wanted to be the cool mom who didn't pressure her son. A very silly mistake of mine. On this very day, my son was at his grandparents' house as usual, but we had a free day at work, so I decided to pick my son up from school, but I was about an hour late. His granddad had come for him. I went to my parents' house without informing them and knocked on the door. It seemed like no one was around. I was about to leave when I heard my father's voice from the backyard, so I went ahead to check him out. On reaching there, I saw my father with a stopwatch and my 5-year-old sweating and struggling with push-ups. And the worst part was my dad didn't tell my son to stop, he just kept encouraging him to keep on. He still had some other activities. I was so mad at my dad, I told my son to go inside and confronted my dad, and all he had to say was that he was training him to become his own man. My dad was training my 5-year-old son to become a man. I asked him how long it had been going on, and he said since I started bringing him over. The worst part was that my dad didn't see anything wrong in what he was doing. He kept saying he didn't want his grandson to be a wuss like my brother. Didn't he think about the downside? This could lead to my son becoming a bully if he knows he's able to overpower his mates. And why train a 5-year-old boy with such intense workouts and tell him to lie to me about it when he should be doing normal 5-year-old simple activities? I decided then and there that I had had enough of my dad's bull and cut him out of my family's life. My mom came back to see me angrily shouting at my dad, and of course, she defended her husband, which just annoyed me even more. It is obvious my dad has some serious issues he needs to work on, and I cannot deal with this back and forth anymore if he doesn't get the necessary help he needs. I took some time off of work and spent more time with my son. I also recently gave birth to my daughter and haven't let my parents near her since. They are only allowed to see her on the condition that my dad gets a letter of recovery from a therapist. Is a letter of therapy an actual thing that happens? I mean, I guess it doesn't have to be a formal thing for a therapist to write a piece of paper that says, "Okay, he's fixed now, I suppose." Would a therapist even be comfortable doing that? Also, hi, I'm Steven, and if you guys enjoy crazy stories of revenge, it would be amazing if you left a like or left a review if you're listening to my podcast. That said, our next story is, best friend spreads a rumor about me in school, so I make him break his jaw. I'm what people would call an introvert. The maximum amount of friends that I, 16-year-old male, have had at a time is 3. I like to keep to myself more than anything, to blend into the background instead of standing out in any way. I hated the limelight, and till now, I don't know how these celebrities cope. It's really strange having random strangers know everything about you. It gives me the same feeling as being naked in public. I was pretty much contented with my non-existent social life, and because I'm very self-aware, I knew that I had a very small set of people around me who appreciated my sense of humor. Because of this, I didn't see any reason to want to be in other social circles. But then, not everybody has the same level of contentment as I do. I'm talking about my best friend in sophomore year, Brian, 16-year-old male. I met Brian at the beginning of the school year. He was a transfer student from some school in the countryside. His parents moved to the city for work, and that's why he had to change schools. When the principal introduced him to the class on the first day, I didn't pay him any heed, because I didn't think he was my type of guy. But as it was with new kids who didn't know anybody in a new school, during lunch break, he gravitated toward the table with the least amount of people, which turned out to be my table. He asked if he could sit with me and my other friend, Kyle, and I said sure. We didn't talk much that day, just about his family and how his former school was like. The next day after school, I went to science club as usual, and there I saw Brian, talking to the leader of the science club. We talked again, and I learned that he was a very devoted member of his previous school's science club. We had something in common, and so we started to talk more. At the end of our meeting, I invited him to walk home with me and Kyle. There, I found out that we had even more things in common. He liked the same video games I liked: Call of Duty, Spider-Man, God of War. He had every single one of them. So that same day, we all decided to go back to my place because Brian was sure that he was going to whoop my butt in Mortal Kombat. And he was right, he did whoop my butt. He's the best gamer I know till date. Besides our joined love for science and video games, he also liked anime. We spent the rest of the day talking about the mangas we've all read, and it was a lot of fun. It's not every day that you find someone you have things in common with on that kind of level, so obviously we all started hanging out together. We were seen together 90% of the time in school, and after school hours, we spent the rest of the day in either my home or Kyle or Brian's. It didn't take too long before people started to call us best friends. But being friends with me and Kyle wasn't enough for Brian. Ever since he transferred to our school, I've caught him looking over at the popular kids table countless times. He wanted to be friends with them. That bit was very obvious from the way he talked about them whenever we were playing games. I didn't want to say anything at first because I didn't really care, but at one point it became too much. One day, we were playing a Formula 1 racing game and he mentioned that Riley, one of the girls in the popular circle, was throwing a party at her house. He was talking about how cool it would have been to be invited and what he'll do to get an invite. I got fed up and told him it was futile trying to make friends with people like Riley and her other friends. All they cared about was parties, who's dating who, and who's wearing what. He'll never fit in. Besides, they saw everyone else as inferior, so they probably won't even give him a chance to be in their group. That was the last time Brian mentioned it to me, and I thought that was the end, until one Tuesday during lunch break, Kyle and I were at our regular table, but there was no sign of Brian. I tried calling him, but his phone was switched off. Throughout our time at the cafeteria, we waited for him, but he didn't show up. Then, when it was time for our next period, we saw him at the hallway talking to Jake. Jake, 17-year-old male, was one of the guys in Riley's friend group. He was a lacrosse player and the vice captain of the swim team. I was kind of surprised because I never thought Jake would talk to someone he deemed below him. I was a bit curious as to what they were talking about, but not curious enough that I would ask Brian. At the end of the school day, we walked home together as usual. That was when Kyle asked why he didn't come for lunch. He said he had offered to help Jake do his assignment the previous day, and he'd gone to give it to him during the lunch break. I didn't ask why he offered, I just kept it moving. The next few days, Brian started to join us for lunch less and less. There was always one excuse or the other, but eventually he stopped coming altogether and started to join Jake's table. I wasn't even mad because we were in high school. There was always a shuffle of friends, and you won't be with the same person forever. We still said hi in the hallways, and once in a while he came around to my place or Kyle's for games. Jake's friends were big on bicycle stunts. And because of this, Brian decided to get a bike so he could fit in with them. He stopped coming over for video games and he spent his free time practicing stunts on his new bike. One day, I saw Brian in the hallway talking to one of the other guys in Jake's group. He had told me that we were going to hang out during the weekend to do some science projects. He didn't show up and I called him several times because he had borrowed my textbook, which was crucial for the project. I walked up to him and asked him why he didn't show up. The guy he was talking to, Lucas, 17-year-old male, got offended that I walked up to them talking, and before I could say anything, he asked me to leave. I expected that Brian was going to say something, a simple, "He's my friend," or "I know the guy," but he just stood there watching as I walked away. I felt insulted when it happened, but it wasn't enough for me to retaliate. Over the next few weeks, Brian changed completely. He started to join Jake and his group in bullying the first years and other students. It was crazy because he had once told me how much he hated bullying. He was bullied in his previous school and it was a difficult time for him. I just can't believe that he would become a bully after all that. But then, you never really know people. The last straw was when Brian decided to spread a false rumor about me. It was one Friday in school. I had gone alone because Kyle was feeling under the weather and couldn't come with me. When I got to school, I noticed that the other students were looking at me funny. I didn't understand what was going on because it never happened before. Like I said, I was always in the background and these people barely knew my name. All of a sudden, people were looking at me and pointing fingers. I had to go to the restroom to make sure that I wasn't wearing my clothes inside out or two different colored sneakers. It lasted for the greater part of the day, and during lunchtime, I settled in my normal corner. Jake and his guys came over to my table and said the weirdest thing ever. They asked me how long I've been fantasizing about Riley. I didn't understand them, but they kept asking the question. When I told them to leave me alone, they almost got physical. Jake pushed my food away from the table and pulled me till I'm standing. He was about to hit me when a senior intervened and told Jake to back off. His name was Rod, 18-year-old male. I thanked Rod and asked him why they were after me, and Rod said Brian had told his friends that back when we used to hang out in my place, that I wouldn't shut up about Riley and how I wanted to sleep with her. I couldn't believe my ears. That was the craziest accusation I've ever heard. I had never mentioned having any interest for any girl, and Brian was the one who usually wouldn't shut up about Riley. When I got home, I told Kyle what had happened, and he was just as appalled as I was. The next day, I confronted Brian and he had the guts to lie to my face. He said that everything he told them was true and that I was too embarrassed to own up to the truth. I decided that I wasn't going to let him get away with spreading lies against me. He could stop being friends with me or bully people as much as he liked, but I would never let him use me as an avenue to gain more popularity with his friends. Kyle and I worked on a plan to get back at him, and by Saturday, we knew exactly what to do. Every Friday, Brian and his new friends stayed in school for a few hours after the close just to do their bicycle stunts at the school's makeshift rink. I had to wait till Friday to carry out my plan, and this suited me because Brian wouldn't be expecting me to take revenge then. That Friday morning, after everyone had gone to class, Kyle and I stayed out. Kyle stood watch while I went to Brian's bike. I loosened the tire hub and the brake support, then we both went to class. At the end of the day, we stayed back to watch the imminent accident. Jake and the other guys went their turn, and soon enough, it was Brian's turn. He rode into the rink without checking his bike first, and the tire got loose. He was thrown off the bike and he landed face first onto the hard concrete. He was taken to the hospital immediately, and he spent the next few days there. He broke his jaw and couldn't come to school for some time. Aside the pain of the accident, lots of people captured the video of his fail, and it quickly spread throughout the school. He became a meme, an object of laughter, which was one of his greatest fears. Till today, no one knew what happened to his bike, and we're still in the clear. I mean, considering the fallout of what happened here, OP's lucky that they just stopped at a broken jaw and not a broken alive. I think OP should use this as a huge learning lesson and realize they could have just ended him. That said, our next story is Revenge at Long Final Last. Looking back now, the one thing I could never understand was how I was being bullied all my life while growing up, and there was quite literally nothing I could have done about it. Well, I guess so. I have to rephrase that. It wasn't like there was nothing I could have done, but rather I was too afraid to do something. As for one, there was an age gap between myself and my bully, and secondly, I was as skinny as a person could be at the time. I guess this was what made me quite the easy target. I just couldn't wrap my head around the fact, as every single day in school was heck for me. But then again, I guess karma does exist, as I was able to grow out of the shell of my former self and be born anew as a whole different person. And even though I might not have had the best of glow-ups, but then again, I know I can proudly bat my chest and say that this was by far one of the best ways I could have gotten back at the one guys that made my life a living heck back then. Let's take it right from the very beginning. I, male 27, being the only son from my single-parent mother, was and had always been a really introverted kid. I was one of those kids back in high school that usually had little to no friends, and the one friend I did have, I was always feeling like he was being my friend simply as a favor, or rather because he saw me as a charity case. I couldn't understand why this was so, but then it was just how I felt at the time. I had little to no knowledge of some basic societal constructs, and the only one I did have foreknowledge of was having actual friends or friend groups. But I don't think this was possible for me at the time, seeing how overly introverted I was. Again, I guess this could be attributed to the fact that there was no father figure in my life. First of all, as my father had passed on quite earlier on in my life, and although things had been really tough for my mother, she definitely didn't give up on me, as she was always there to make sure that I lacked not the basic necessities, nor the things that I would need in order to shape myself into a better man. But the one thing she forgot, completely intact, which I wouldn't blame her for, is actually loving her child. Because every single day, I could see these looks of disappointment in her eyes. I couldn't tell whether she was disappointed in myself or herself, seeing as she never spoke about her feelings and all, but then I always did the best that I could in order to make sure that she was always proud of the person I would become. And although I had quite the slow start, I eventually did make her the proudest parent ever. Anyways, that is by the way for now, so back to the main issue. Following the fact that I had quite the family issue, I never really thought that there was anyone that truly understood me. But then, the one friend that I did manage to make back in school was the only person that I can proudly say truly knew what I was going through. This was until I found out that he was just out to get something on me that he would use to make me the laughingstock of the entire school. Now, don't get me wrong, but the fact that he did what he did wasn't even on my mind at the time, but the one thing that I just couldn't wrap my head around was the fact that he chose to do this all for the sake of having fun with me, just for jest. And I just felt really disappointed in him, and the one thing I chose to do at the time was apparently not what he was expecting, and I guess this didn't really sit well with him, as from that moment onwards, he had employed the services of some of the students in a higher grade to physically tease me every single day, as they called it. But it was just their fancy word of beating the crap out of me every single day for no particular reason. Thinking back properly now, I guess they had one because they were paid to do so. But then I just couldn't understand the motive behind my former friend, let's call him Joel's, actions. But then I could do literally nothing but watch at the time. I was always pondering over the reason as to why this was so, but then after taking a deep look on the situation of things, I got to realize that I stood quite literally no chance with them, and I just resigned to my fate and kept on taking the full brunt of the beatings and bullying for as long as I could physically and mentally endure. Then one fateful day when things took quite a terrible turn back at home. On this day, my mother was as usual already heading out for work, and she was already done with making the necessary preparations that I would need in order to get through the day and all, when all of a sudden she just collapsed right there on the kitchen floor. I couldn't understand why or what exactly had happened, but I knew for a fact that something was definitely wrong. I immediately took the phone and called the emergency services, but I forgot that our phone line was disconnected as we were quite behind on the phone bill. And immediately I ran as fast as I could to the nearest neighbor's place as I needed to make haste. I was eventually able to get a hold of emergency services, and they were able to arrive just in time and take her to the hospital. I was only allowed to come over to the hospital later with an older guardian or someone much older than I was at the time. And then my neighbor was so kind, they offered to go in my place and make sure that things were okay with my mom, and he sent me on my way to school. I don't know why he did this because there was no way I could have even focused in school when my mother wasn't in the best of conditions and I was still kept in the dark on this matter. Anyways, I did as I was told and I went back to school with the hopes that my mother was doing quite okay, even though I was quite literally worried for the most part of the day and it was apparent. But then, just as you would have guessed, this didn't even stop my bullies from exerting their daily dose of dominating my life, making my life and my day all the more worse than it had to be. On this day, I don't know what exactly was different from the other days, but I was so keen on retaliating. I was holding back myself so much that I never thought I could have had that much patience and self-control. When they had left, I made a vow to myself. As I lay down there on the floor, bleeding and aching all over my body from the beatings, that I was going to make good and judicious use of my time and any and every opportunity that presents itself before me, all in order to make my life better for my mother and myself. I know how this may sound, but then again, I also made another separate vow that day, and this was to definitely make these people feel the way I felt that very day, and just like that, I had inadvertently set myself on a journey that was going to change my life for the better, and also that of my mother, while harboring the feeling of vengeance against these set of individuals, as their faces were forever ingrained into my memory. All 6 of them. After the day at school had ended, I immediately rushed all the way to the hospital, as my neighbor was already there waiting for my arrival, and thankfully my mother was doing quite alright, as she was as hale and hearty as she usually was prior to what had happened. The doctor said that she was apparently overworking herself and she just passed out from stress, and that she just needed to take it easy for the next 2 days and she should be back to her usual self. I was glad that at the very least there was nothing wrong with her that could have been life-threatening. After that day, my neighbor kept checking up on my mom and myself as he wanted to be sure that she was heeding to the doctor's rest orders, and for this I was truly grateful. However, I needed to do something in order to ensure that we don't lose the house, and also that we don't starve, also to relieve my mother of some of the stress that she was under. And so I turned to the one person that I thought could provide the least assistance at the time, and this was our trusty neighbor, who at the time was a small-time business owner and was very proficient at his business. But the one problem he had was the fact that he had poor management skills, and he was seriously lacking in sales. Well, from my perspective that is, because when I went to him with my observations and ideas that I thought would definitely be useful in order for him to take his business to the next level, he was ecstatic and eager to try my strategies out, although he was a bit skeptical at the very beginning. However, after giving it some thought, he realized that there's quite literally nothing he could lose by doing this, and he eventually got it. And I can proudly tell you that, as at the time, I was still in my penultimate year of high school. As at the time when I was graduating from high school, his business had gone across all states in the country, and he was already planning on going international, and all of this was due to the fact that his product was very much demanded, and he kept on receiving deals from all over. He had even told me that when I was done with high school, he had a position waiting for me, as he greatly valued my contribution, as I was the one with the idea and he just made it happen. At the time, his company was valued at over $35 million, but after going international and receiving several buyout offers, it went up even higher to nearly $100 million. And he was so generous that he was willing to offer me a 25% stake in the company's assets, as he said it was my reward for all my hard work. It was the greatest moment of my life. I felt like I was finally being rewarded for all the struggles myself and my mother had to go through these past years. We eventually had to bring in more people to work with us, as we were beginning to get quite short-staffed and all, and I was placed in charge of the recruitment process. I had reviewed quite a number of people and none were up to my standard, but when I came across a set of names, I immediately called them in. And you can guess who these people were. The same set of guys that were my bullies back in high school. Were now unable to get into college and were looking for a means of livelihood. When they came in and they saw me seated there, the look of intense regret hit them, and about 2 of them broke down in tears while the others couldn't take their eyes off their feet. I guess they already knew what was waiting for them, as they had all resigned to their fates. I sat on the chair directly in front of them, but it felt like I was on a mountain, and they were very close to sea level. I gave them all the positions, as I wanted them to see me every single day and regret their last actions for as long as they lived. Revenge was successful at last, was what I thought to myself at that moment. I'm assuming OP's gonna pull some strings and make sure that they stay at the absolute bottom of the totem pole. No raises, no promotions. These guys are probably stuck on janitor duty mopping the bathrooms for the rest of their time there until they quit. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. Now, if you want to hear another crazy revenge story, check out that video on the left. Or if you missed my latest video, check out that video on the right. That said, I'll see you all next time with some more stories.